At Sunday dinner, my parents cornered me about my boyfriend, and my dad said, "He's not from our circle, Megan. You deserve someone with a background that can help your future, not hinder it." That's when I stood up and knocked over my water glass, watching it shatter on their expensive Persian rug while I told them exactly what I thought of their elitist bullshit. I'm a freelance marketing consultant making $85,000 annually, with a client roster that includes 3 Fortune 500 companies. I have my own apartment, excellent credit, and a portfolio that speaks for itself. Yet my parents act like I'm some naive college kid who needs their guidance on every life decision, especially when it comes to James, the man I've been dating for almost a year. James manages an independent bookstore downtown and makes around $45,000 a year. He grew up with a single mother in a rough neighborhood, put himself through community college while working full-time, and has the strongest work ethic of anyone I know. But to my parents, he's just that bookstore boy who isn't worthy of their precious daughter. My father owns a mid-sized accounting firm with 18 employees and pulls in about $300,000 annually. My mother comes from what she calls old family money, though it's really just her grandfather's modest real estate investments that paid off decades ago. They paid for my private school education and my degree at an expensive art college, which I'm genuinely grateful for. But they seem to think this financial investment gives them permanent veto power over my personal choices. The warning signs started early. When I first mentioned James, my mother's immediate questions were about his education and family background. When I told her he'd attended community college and his mother worked as a nurse's aide, she got this pinched expression like she'd tasted something sour. "Well, I'm sure he's nice enough for now," she said, emphasizing the word now in a way that made my stomach clench. The first dinner was a disaster. My mother accidentally spilled red wine on James's shirt within 10 minutes of his arrival. He was incredibly gracious about it, laughing and saying it wasn't his interview shirt anyway. But then she did it again at the next dinner 2 weeks later. When I asked her privately how someone accidentally spills wine on the same person twice, she just shrugged and said some people are naturally clumsy around certain types of people. Things escalated quickly after that. My mother started sending me dating app links just for fun and forwarding articles about how relationships formed in your early 20s rarely last. Last week, when I borrowed her iPad to look something up, I discovered she'd created dating profiles for me on 3 different apps, using photos stolen from my Instagram and bios that made me sound like I was hunting for a trust fund husband. When I confronted her, she had the audacity to defend it. "I'm just keeping your options open, sweetheart. James seems nice enough, but is he really long-term material?" I slammed my hand on her granite countertop so hard it hurt. "You have no right to create fake profiles for me. This is completely inappropriate and invasive." She acted wounded, clutching her chest like I'd physically attacked her. "I'm only thinking about your future, Megan. You're young and beautiful and successful. Why settle for someone who can barely keep a bookstore running in the digital age?" But the Sunday dinner confrontation was the final straw. My father started making pointed comments about how James's bookstore probably isn't financially viable, with Amazon dominating the market, asking if he'd considered a more stable career path. My mother chimed in, asking if I was really sure about settling down so young and reminding me that my cousin Teresa had just gotten engaged to someone whose family owns half the commercial real estate in their town. When I defended James, explaining that he's incredibly hardworking and treats me with more respect than anyone I'd ever dated, my father leaned back in his chair with this condescending smile. "That's all very sweet, honey, but let's be realistic about your future. You deserve someone who can match your ambition and status." That's when he dropped the line about James not being from our circle and how I deserved someone with the right background. I stood up so fast that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a screech that made everyone wince. "Our circle," I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean people with money? Because that seems to be your only actual objection to James. He's kind, intelligent, hardworking, and treats me like I'm the most important person in his world. But none of that matters to you because his paycheck isn't big enough. My father's face went red. Don't be dramatic, Megan. We're talking about practical compatibility. Financial stress destroys marriages. James has never asked me for money or taken advantage of me in any way, I shot back. If anything, he's annoyingly independent and insists on paying his share of everything, even though I make more than he does. The only people treating me like an ATM are you two. What happened next changed everything between us forever. 3 days later, James called me at work, sounding shaken. I need to tell you something, but I don't know how you're going to react. My father had contacted James and asked him to meet for coffee. James thought maybe my dad was finally making an effort to get to know him, so he agreed. But when they met at Starbucks, my father spent exactly 5 minutes on small talk before sliding an actual check across the table. $10,000 made out to cash for James to break up with me and disappear from my life. I just stared at it, James told me, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. When I pushed it back and told him I wasn't interested, he got angry and said he could make it $15,000 if that's what it would take. James had walked out at that point, but not before my father delivered a parting shot about how men like you always leave eventually when something better comes along anyway. That night, I called my parents at 11 p.m., waking them up. When my father answered, I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Did you really think you could buy James out of my life like he was some kind of debt collector? I demanded. My father tried to act confused, but when I mentioned the specific amount and the Starbucks location, he knew he was caught. Then he actually tried to defend it, saying he was investing in my future and that he knew how these things go. James would have taken the money eventually, he said with absolute certainty. I was just expediting the process. I was shaking with rage. You offered my boyfriend money to dump me. Do you understand how insane that is? The next morning, I texted my mother asking if she knew about the bribe. Her response was a long paragraph about how they were just concerned. And wouldn't it be better to find out now rather than later if James was really in it for the right reasons? I drove to their house that evening, determined to have this out in person. When I arrived, they were both acting concerned, like I was having some kind of breakdown. My mother tried to hug me, and I literally stepped backward and told her not to touch me. I know about the bribe, I said, sitting down across from them in their pristine living room. And I've never been so disappointed in anyone in my entire life. My father had the nerve to call it a test to see if James was genuine. That's not a test, I said. That's emotional manipulation and financial coercion. My mother started crying, her go-to tactic whenever she's losing an argument, saying they just wanted what was best for me. I asked them point blank what exactly about James wasn't best for me. That's when my father said it again, the line that would echo in my head for months. He's not from our circle, Megan. You deserve someone with a background and connections that can help your future, not hinder it. I laughed, actually laughed, right in his face. James has never hindered me. He supports every single goal I have. By our circle, you mean people with money, right? Because that seems to be your only real criterion for human worth. My mother got defensive, saying I was being deliberately obtuse and that life isn't a fairy tale where love conquers all. When I pointed out that I'd been financially independent for 2 years, she played her trump card. Yes, darling, but who paid for the education that allows you to do that? There it was, the financial hammer I'd been expecting. My father leaned forward with this patronizing expression and delivered their ultimatum. Either I come to my senses and break up with James, or they would cut off their financial support completely. This included the remaining tuition for my final semester, my spot on their family phone plan, and my health insurance coverage. I stood up so fast I knocked over the glass of water on their coffee table, watching it shatter on their expensive rug. You can't buy me any more than you could buy James." We ended up shouting at each other across their living room, with my father insisting I was making an emotional decision I'd regret, and me telling him the only thing I regretted was thinking they cared about my happiness more than their social image. When I asked point blank if they would really cut me off completely if I stayed with James, my father looked me straight in the eye and said yes. "You need to learn there are consequences to poor decisions." I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. My mother caught up to me, crying and asking where I was going. "I'm going home to my boyfriend who actually respects me as a person instead of treating me like a puppet you can control with money." She grabbed my arm, trying to stop me from leaving, and I yanked away so hard I stumbled into the wall and knocked down one of her precious crystal vases. I didn't even apologize, just walked out and slammed the door behind me. But here's what my parents didn't know about their dramatic, ungrateful daughter. I'd been preparing for financial independence since college. My freelance business wasn't just a side hustle. It was a carefully planned career strategy with multiple revenue streams and long-term contracts. I had $23,000 in personal savings, 0 credit card debt, and 3 clients who'd already expressed interest in expanding their contracts with me. My largest client, Peterson & Associates, had been hinting about bringing me on as their full-time marketing director, which would bump my salary to $95,000 plus benefits. More importantly, I had professional relationships my parents knew nothing about. My client roster included David Peterson, whose wife Rachel ran the city's largest private employment agency. There was Michelle Torres, who owned a boutique PR firm and had connections throughout the local business community, and Rebecca Johnson, whose family ran one of the most successful restaurant chains in the state. These weren't just business relationships. Over 2 years of working together, they'd become genuine mentors who'd expressed concern about my parents' controlling behavior and offered support if I ever needed it. The day after the confrontation, I started implementing my independence plan. First, I contacted the financial aid office at my college and arranged an emergency meeting. With my academic record and the sudden loss of family financial support, I qualified for both need-based aid and 2 different academic scholarships that would cover my remaining tuition. Next, I called Rebecca Johnson, who immediately offered me additional freelance work and connected me with her insurance broker for an individual health plan. Michelle Torres not only increased my retainer by 40%, but recommended me to 2 new clients who were looking for ongoing marketing support. David Peterson's wife, Rachel, was even more helpful. When I explained my situation, she was appalled by my parents' behavior and offered me a part-time position at her agency that would provide steady income and networking opportunities. Within a week, I'd replaced my parents' financial support and actually improved my income situation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their attempt to control me through money had forced me to become more financially successful than I'd been while dependent on them. But the most satisfying part was what happened to my parents' social standing once word got out. Rachel Peterson mentioned my situation to her husband, who happened to be friends with several members of my father's country club. David was horrified that someone would try to bribe their daughter's boyfriend and made his feelings known at their next golf game. My mother's book club, where she'd spent months complaining about my inappropriate boyfriend, suddenly got very quiet when Rebecca Johnson's mother, a founding member, mentioned that her daughter spoke very highly of my character and professionalism. Apparently, Mrs. Johnson made it clear that she thought any parent who would cut off their child's education over a relationship was showing questionable judgment. The consequences started rippling outward faster than I'd expected. My father's business partner, whose wife was friends with Rachel Peterson, started asking pointed questions about my father's judgment and family stability. In their social circle, being known as the couple who tried to bribe their daughter's boyfriend wasn't exactly a reputation boost. 3 weeks after my declaration of independence, James was offered the opportunity to buy the bookstore from his retiring boss. The owner had been impressed by James's business acumen and customer relationships and offered him favorable financing terms, but James needed a co-signer for the business loan. That's when I made my move. I offered to co-sign, backing it up with my improved credit score and documented income history. The bank approved the loan within a week. James owned his own business, and I owned 30% of it as a silent partner. 2 months later, I graduated summa cum laude with zero debt and a job offer from Peterson & Associates that included a $95,000 starting salary, full benefits, and a signing bonus. James's bookstore was thriving, hosting events and partnering with local schools and universities for educational programs that significantly boosted revenue. The day after graduation, I sent my parents a registered letter with copies of my degree, my employment contract, the bookstore's profit reports, and the deed to the small house James and I had bought together. The note was simple. This is what happens when you bet against someone who knows their own worth. My father called within an hour, alternating between apologies and attempts to justify their behavior. When he tried to take credit for motivating me to become more independent, I hung up on him. My mother's response was more passive-aggressive, a fruit basket with a card saying she was proud of my accomplishments and hoped we could move past this unfortunate misunderstanding. I donated the fruit to a homeless shelter and threw the card away. The final vindication came 6 months later at my cousin Teresa's wedding. My parents had been bragging to the entire extended family about Teresa's fiancé, whose family owned a real estate development company. But at the reception, I overheard my great-aunt telling another relative that she was much more impressed with my success story. Megan built her own career and bought her own house before she was 25, she said. That takes real character. And her young man seems lovely. He's been so attentive to your grandmother all evening. My parents, standing nearby, looked uncomfortable as several other relatives chimed in with praise for James's manners and my professional accomplishments. My father's face was particularly tight when Uncle Robert mentioned that his business associates had heard great things about my marketing work. James and I left that reception hand in hand, financially secure, professionally respected, and completely free from my parents' control. As we drove home to the house we'd bought together, I realized that their attempt to manipulate me through money had accomplished the exact opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of driving James away, they'd forced me to prove my independence and his commitment. Instead of maintaining control over my choices, they'd lost any influence over my life. Instead of protecting their social reputation, they'd become known as the couple who tried to buy their daughter's compliance and failed spectacularly. 6 months later, my parents still send holiday cards and birthday gifts, always with notes expressing hope that we can rebuild our relationship. But the conditions remain the same. They want me back in their lives without James, or with James relegated to someone I'm just having fun with until I find someone more suitable. I return their gifts and keep their cards as reminders of how much better my life became when I stopped letting other people's money dictate my choices. James and I are planning our own wedding now, funded entirely by our combined incomes and attended by people who actually respect our relationship. My parents won't be on the guest list unless they offer a genuine apology and full acceptance of James. Given their track record, I'm not holding my breath, but I'm also not worried about it anymore. I learned that the best way to prove someone wrong about your worth is to build a life so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. The bookstore is expanding to a second location next year. My marketing firm just landed its biggest contract ever, and every morning I wake up in a house I helped buy, next to a man who never once suggested I should compromise my principles for financial security. That's worth more than all the family money in the world.